Good morning. It's good to be with you again. We want to this morning continue with our lesson number 7 from the second module in the Bible and Biblical Interpretation. Module 2 was called Basic Bible Interpretation, and this lesson, lesson 7, we want to continue with now. It's on prophecy and the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament. And where we left off was on the part of the lesson that had to do with prophetic interpretation and hermeneutics, or the rules we use to engage the Scripture, the rules we use to interpret the Scripture. The material I'm going to give you this morning comes from Dr. Zook's book, Basic Bible Interpretation, pages 241 to 248. Just want to give credit to him for these thoughts. In previous lectures, we covered the 3 axioms, if you remember, that form the basis for a number of interpretive corollaries. Those same 3 axioms, and the first is that the Bible is a human book. Secondly, the Bible is a divine book. And finally, the Bible is a book about Jesus Christ. He is the primary focus of the Bible. He tells us that, and we talked about the verses that confirm that. But these 3 axioms give us a framework for principles to follow as we engage prophecy or as we interpret prophecy. So we want to follow the principles that we've already taught you with regard to a proper hermeneutic or a proper way to approach the Bible. We want to follow the principles that we have already given you that embrace what we called a normal, grammatical, historical, rhetorical method of biblical interpretation. We want to continue that method as we engage prophecy. The rules that give us this hermeneutical approach are God-given. They're God-given because God is the author of language and communication, and He created us as human beings to be able to interact and communicate. We reflect Him. And these rules that are part of language and communication, we do not make them up. You remember we talked about that. We discover them. They're part of language that we use every day. We discover the rules and we use them then in our communication. But really they're God-given because He's the author of language and communication. So we want to continue with that as we talk about prophecy. So first, the idea is to consider the historical element in prophetic interpretation, and that means that the cultural background and the circumstances of the prophets need to be considered as they gave their prophetic messages to the nation of Israel. We need to know, essentially, initially, what their historical circumstances were. They spoke on behalf of another, namely God, as they gave their messages. They were responsible to communicate the messages they received from God to the nation. And sometimes those messages were very practical about how the nation was supposed to live in light of the covenant that they had entered into with God. And often they were prophetic in the truest sense of the term. They talked about future coming events, the things that were the nation of Israel was expecting. The prophets often spoke then of circumstances contemporary with their generation, sometimes pointing up or pointing out what God was doing in the immediate future, and other times projecting events to be fulfilled in the distant future. They talked not only about the immediate and what God had promised to bring in their history, but also then it looks to the future, the distant future. God's words, in other words, were not isolated from the stream of history. And often near the fulfillment of near events that were predicted projects us to future events that will occur as God brings all things to a close in terms of history. Even the words of Paul regarding the rapture of the church in 1 Thess 4 13 through 18 were given to address a problem the Thessalonian believers faced. So often the prophetic message of the prophets was given in the context of the immediate circumstances and need or problems that were being faced, just like with Paul. The Apostle John wrote the book of Revelation to believers when they were undergoing persecution in the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, around AD 51 to 96. Reading that God's program would include the establishing of Christ's reign on earth and the accompanying destruction of his enemies would have given the first century Christians great comfort, just as it has done for every generation of believers since that